Nighttime on Still Waters. This is NB 506812, narrowcasting into the night from somewhere on Britain's waterways. "23rd May, Sunday. Voices lift across the water. No words, just sound. A copy of Baisao in my hand, lingering over phrases and lines in the soft evening sun. I too have my cup of tea beside me. Pine wind among the reeds. Carp twist in crystal light. Swallows dip low to drink. It's the night of a blue moon, the second full moon to fall in a month. And it's the end of a busy warm day of blue skies and sunshine and elderflower-scented warmth. But now the crowds have gone home, and the canal and towpath settle back in a contented stillness. A light breeze ruffles the water and reed, stirring the little pockets of the day's heat. The erica creaks at her moorings, and an owl hoots in the distance. This is the narrowbird erica, narrowcasting into the welcoming darkness of a warm May night, to you, wherever you are. Greetings, you made it. I was really hoping you'd be here. The kettle's already on, the biscuit barrel is on the side, and there's a chair waiting especially for you. So come inside and welcome aboard. This week, summer came early, bringing with it temperatures of 32 degrees. That's about 90 degrees Fahrenheit. We've had much hotter, just not at this time of the year, which is a little concerning. And unusually for Britain, it coincided with a bank holiday, the old Whitsun bank holiday. And so it came with the air of occasion and relaxation. Someone brought a paddling pool out, but only Maggie would go in, and even then with a gingerly reserve. It's strange, as a number of the local dogs really love to swim in the canal or river if they can find it, Maggie included. And the smell of barbecue and suntan lotion lazily curled over the baking ground. At these times, the tall grasses feel good. We search for shade, sprawling beneath trees on a cushion of rye and chickweed starred pink with cranespill, watching the scarlet poppy fire and the Tibetan flag masts of vetch nod and dance on our low, close skyline. And a hard white sun shimmering off the water like arc welders' glare dazzles and blinds, sending reflected heat right back into the boat. Curtains remain closed. The temperature rises. The problem is that along with the sunshine there is, unusually, hardly a breath of wind. The ventilation has to come from fans and air coolers. I take Max for a swim, half wishing, only half wishing, mind you, that I could join her in the dirty, muddy waters of the canal. Frogs croak among the reeds and irises. Carp, in the midst of their spawning, bask just under the water, their dorsal fins piercing the surface like soporific sharks. Fortunately, there's a lot of movement on the canal. It's half-term, and so the water remains aerated. This time last year, when this part of the canal was closed because of a breach, these still waters turned lethal for them, and I'd be getting worried for them by now. And every now and then, processions of ducklings buzz and fizz behind Mum, who's keeping a wary out for magpie and kite. Damoiselle and damselflies dart prehistoric along the water's edge. Vibrant colours flash and spark. Blue, red, orange. It would feel like high to late summer if everything wasn't still so lush and green. Even the trees are only just losing that light lime and the emeralds of their first growth before they deepen into the deep forest greens of summer. Spiral galaxies of elderflower perfume the towpath with the scent of vacation and excitement. I can almost taste the sugary and lemony bite of the citric acid. Dogwood stars the hedgerows, and the ox-eyed daisies are growing rich and deep along the steep bank beside the canal. Maggie and I wade waist and knee-deep through them. A flurry of disturbed insects jewel the air. Butterflies lift and flutter. A moorhen breaks cover to scurry to the opposite bank, and the heron lurks in places green and shady. Thank you for taking the time to contact me. It's always good to hear from you and to hear about what you're doing. And thank you so much to Angela on Blue Sky for your post recommending the last podcast, More Raven Than Rook. I really appreciate it, Angela, and I'm delighted that you enjoyed it. Oh, and greetings also to Captain Lala. And over on Facebook, greetings and thank you to Tracy Thomas. Yes, I know exactly what you mean about automating lighthouses. Oh, and also hello to Perry Coleman. I hope you're doing well, Perry. And of course, hello and greetings to Jason and Karen on the narrowboat Dera Rosa. I must say, she's looking really smart in her new pram canopy, and it's good to hear that you've been coping okay with the heat. For my money, hands down, this is the toughest part of living on a boat. You can survive this, you can survive anything. And a quick shout out to Instagram and greetings to Orange Cookie and to Mike. And I'm so glad that you both enjoyed the episode. And it was also lovely to hear from Lockwheeler Kevin B over on Mastodon, who, in relation to an earlier episode, wrote to tell me about how mulch kept moving from a neighbour's flower bed and onto the driveway. And certain that it was the work of some local vandal, Kevin went so far as to set up a CCTV camera to catch them in action, only to find the culprit being, you guessed it, a squirrel. Very wisely, Kevin signed off with these sage-like words, "Never ascribe to malice that which is adequately explained by a squirrel." Very wise, Kevin. Wise words indeed. And I've no idea why, but your post about it put me in mind of Lee Thomas up there in the Southern Rockies, with a variety of critters getting up to all sorts of nefarious activities. In fact, I just had an email from her in which she ended with this PS, and I'm going to read it to you because this seems to be typical for life up there. PS. Bears have been strolling down my driveway and through my property again. Once in broad daylight, my dogs ran out through the dog door. You got a dog door? Oh, Maggie would love a dog door. Into my yard with their hackles up, bravely barking to chase it away. The bear gave them a contemptuous look and kept strolling by. I loved it, even though I realized that he is looking for garbage and should not be there. He or she was a sort of russet colour and very beautiful, and I painted him in my nature journal. And don't worry, it was a reminder to check my surroundings before going out the door or getting out of the car, and I don't go for walks at or near dusk. I also carry a tiny little pepper spray in my pocket when out walking the dogs, and make sure to stay alert. Oh gosh, Lee, what an exciting life you lead up there. And slipping across the water from Colorado over to Australia, Tania, hello and thank you. Really pleased that you enjoyed the last episode. I also love that you used the word chuffed. I thought it was a peculiarly British term. Is it also used over there in Australia too? But I'm glad you were chuffed to hear your name. And of course, hello to Taki. And I just want to finish this section by offering a huge apology. And it goes to Jeff Van Booven. Jeff, thank you so much for your lovely email about the last episode on clock winding. It was really interesting, and in fact I loved it so much, and there was such a lot in it that I decided not to respond straight away. It's a really busy time at the moment, and I wanted to be able to reply in a considered way and give it the proper response it deserved, rather than just rushing off, thanks man, that's great type of email. And yep, you can all guess what happened. So I am really sorry, Jeff, that my response has been so bad, and I've ended up by giving you a rushed response anyway. However, hopefully, to partially make up for it, I'm including my reflections on your reflections in a little bit later on in this podcast. And so now all that remains for me to do is to say a huge thank you, as always, to all of our Lockwheelers for supporting this podcast. They are Anna McKellar, Susan Baker, Mind Shambles, Clare Hollingsworth, Kevin B., Fleur and David Mcloughlin, Lois Raphael, Tania Yorgey, Andrea Hansen, Chris Hinds, Chris and Alan on the narrowboat The Land of Green Ginger, Captain Arlo, Rebecca Russell, Alison on the narrowboat Mucker, Derek and Pauline on Silver Fox, Anna V, Orange Cookie, Mary Keane, Tony Rutherford, Arabella Holtzapfel, Rory with MJ and Kayla, the narrowboat Precious Jet, Linda Reynolds Perkins, Richard Noble, Carol Ferguson, Tracy Thomas, Mark and Tricia Stowe, and Madeline Smith. Thank you. As I intimated just now, I received a really lovely email from one of our long-time listeners from across the Atlantic, Jeff Van Booven. It was a response to the last episode, More Raven Than Rook, and about my time winding the village clock. Jeff, I hope you don't mind if I read it out, as you make some really interesting points. Jeff wrote, maybe it's because we just had a power outage and I had to reset the only 3 clocks in the house that weren't automatic, compared to my childhood, going from room to room with a watch. But I found myself drifting into thought about the difficulties of ensuring the accuracy of that precious resource, especially as you describe adjusting the hands and pieces to ensure time flows properly. With radio and television, getting the accurate time of the realm doesn't seem like much of a challenge. For ages past, from my sparse reading on the subject, seems to be they just relied on local time, and nobody much tried to organize a national time until the technology allowed or was desired for sailing. However, I find myself a bit disappointed in this answer. It seems to lack romance and human endeavour. I would rather imagine the king sending forth riders with timepieces to cities and towns of the realm, literal time travellers, if you will, to proclaim the official time. Oh, yeah, that would be so good, wouldn't it? The human element, like the names carved into the cupboard, seem to make it more mythical and magical, at least to my sentiments. The people create a connection between time, place, and generations that our mechanization erases or brings to an end. Time, it seems, has gone from a local process of measuring the seasons to a rigid, highly accurate, passive background process delivered to us by the machine. Lost is the transitory period where we were invited to be active participants in the process of keeping time. Thank you for your recollections of the waning moments of that period, and for your podcast, which is always such a wonderful invitation to set aside the now and to spare some time to relax. That's really lovely, Jeff. Thank you so much. And there's so much here to reflect on. Yes, I think you're so right. Our relationship with time and the concept of time is something that's really remarkable and fascinating. And even our understanding of time as this linear path that goes from a beginning to an end is, when you begin to think about it, quite strange. I've been recently reading the philosopher Tyson Yunkaporta's book, Sand Talk. Hi Tania Yorgey. I know you've been reading this book too. And Tyson is also part of the Aboriginal nation in Australia. And his book is this really fascinating and mind-expanding synthesis of various contemporary philosophical and social themes with Aboriginal thinking and perspectives. It's taking me some time to read it, not because he writes badly or densely, far from it in fact, but because there's just so much to think through and to process. And I've rather got stuck on his discussion on time and contrasting the Western linear view, a concept so obvious and self-evident to someone brought up in the West, with the Aboriginal view of it being circular, a concept so obvious and self-evident to somebody brought up within the many of the indigenous groups and nations. For example, within his particular culture, the vocabulary of kinship reflects this cyclical perspective. Consequently, the kinship system resets every third generation in an eternal cycle. Therefore, you have a child, parent, and grandparent. Conceptually, there's no great-grandparent. Instead, the grandparent's parent is once more classified as child in this endless cycle. This exploration of it just turns my head inside out. It's like the literary equivalent of sucking on a Haribo sweet sour. Consequently, conceptually, I'm struggling with it a bit. But I also have to say that now understanding it a little bit better, a lot of the ancient and Eastern stuff that I've been reading begins to make a bit more sense. Things fit together a little more smoothly, and the glaring gaps that I read in some of the ancient texts are no longer gaps. I'm also reminded of the irony that for a long time we measured time on a circular clock face, despite our assumption of this linear understanding of time, which is essentially teleological, which means this belief that there is some kind of end point that things work towards. It's a system of belief that is grounded in the classical Greek philosophy, or at least some of it, and also in some religions. Culturally, we are so embedded in thinking this way that for us it is so self-evident that it seems ludicrous to question it. This whole idea of progress, whether that's expressed in evolutionary terms or social terms or even economic terms, this idea that we're on some journey towards a particular goal, often some ideal or sense of perfection, suffuses our thinking. And we sometimes talk about the march of history as if there were a defined route or direction of travel. And this creates the idea that time functions as a pathway that will lead from a point A to a point B. And when you stop and think about it, that raises a huge number of questions. But we just tend not to see past that feeling of time moving past us, or more accurately, the feeling of us moving through time. It feels so normal to us. But it's also a bit weird though, isn't it? When you think about it. Where do these assumptions come from? But getting back to some of Jeff's observations, I was really struck, Jeff, by your comments on the standardization of time. And that is, again, a really sort of fascinating thing. The standardization of time so that 10 o'clock in the morning in London is exactly the same as 10 o'clock in Birmingham or Newcastle, Swansea or Glasgow is a fascinating story, and one that marks a huge, almost cataclysmic cultural shift, not just in social cohesion, but in the choices for what society perceives as its own specific and particular teleology, goal or endpoint. And the big question here that underlies it, of course, is, well, who decided this? And the answer might point to many of the causes of our modern day ills. But getting back to before all of this, time was, I think, as you intimate, Jeff, much more fluid. Dawn came later or earlier to York than it did to London, according to season, and it didn't really matter. The rhythm of life was dictated by the flow of light tied to the seasons. And time was a marker of hours and days and shifts in the landscape. Time was coloured in greens and browns and whites. Reading Joseph Ashby's memoirs at the end of the 19th century in a rural Warwickshire village, in fact, the very same one that I wound the clock in, clearly the concept of time was familiar to him and to those among whom he lived. The church bells rang out the hour and the quarters. But these seemed to function more as auditory markers of the day, fingerposts, if you like. Time and daily life was much more anchored in the land, the crops that needed harvesting, the land that needed to be ploughed, the daily cycle of light and dark signalling the daily routine, the cycles of the seasons signalling the deeper and longer shifts in life. And so the fact that the bells of St. Mary's rang the 1 o'clock strike 15 minutes before the great bell of St. Stephen's in Aberdeen was neither here nor there. Time flowed across the land at its own rate, according to the landscape and the latitude. Time, in that sense, was more geographical than anything else. And then we have two huge shifts that have a cataclysmic effect on how we view time, and they both stem from the Industrial Revolution. The first is urbanization and its development of factories. Now no longer so rooted in the soil and the seasonal ebb and flow of daylight hours, we begin to see this disconnection of the population from the land that it lives in. It's a trend we can chart through history, or should I say, histories. This growth of cities creates cultural shift in perceptions that become increasingly divorced from nature and the land. We can see it in the first great cities in Mesopotamia, who led the way, in the West at least, in this shift from agriculture and land. The calendar and economics reflecting conceptions of time that no longer followed the moon and its effect on land and water, but the sun. And we can see this shift a little later even in the biblical writings. The Deuteronomic writers introducing a new calendar, with new festivals that no longer marked or were in concert with the land, the cycles of crop and livestock. The shift away from nature to something much more conceptual, more abstract. The great mills and factories of the Industrial Revolution likewise ran to a different flow of time, one that could be more regulated. Shorter working days in the depth of winter gloom now made no sense at all. So knocker-uppers were employed to ensure that the workforce was in place before the sun had risen. Artificial lighting turned night to day. Hours became important. Hours measured the working day. And when you're not at work, the clock was there to tick away the time before it called you back to work. Time no longer seemed to flow in a fluid motion of ebb and flow, but had become rigid. The clock, and with it time, had now become the watchdog of your employer. And so the creeping darkness of the winter's lengthening nights now became just an irrelevance, just an inconvenience that needed to be conquered in the same way that the later canal and railway navvies conquered an obstructing hill or a stretch of marshland. Now the second major shift was the development of the railways. It's been argued that it was the creation of a national railway system that dictated the need for not just accurate timekeeping, but a standardization of it. This was essential for any railway service to operate effectively. Any infrastructure that encompasses a large regional area requires a standardization of its time. Now, it did matter if 1 o'clock in London was 15 minutes earlier than 1 o'clock in Birmingham. Although, of course, I recognise that this in practice means something very different from you, Jeff, over in the States than it does for us in the UK, where we all share a single time zone. However, the principle is the same. The development of the railway system in the UK created some major cultural shifts, not least of which time was no longer tied to sunrise, sunset, and the ebb and flow of light. Another example of a shift is the adoption of sans serif lettering, which was a deliberate marketing strategy. However, arguably, the greatest impact was that now the concept of time was not just rigid, but its rigidity was imposed right across the nation. If you're of a similar age to me, you'll probably remember that pursuit for increasingly more accurate watches and clocks. Advertisements would herald claims about their product being accurate to 100th of a second. As a lad, every tea time I would be sitting in the dining room listening for the 6 pips of the Greenwich time signal at 6 o'clock on the radio. And Dad and I would automatically check our watches, and my black-faced prized seconda, a much-cherished birthday present, was invariably a little out and needed to be readjusted. Hands, including the second hand, lined up for exactly 6 o'clock, and then at the signal on the very last pip, once more my watch was aligned with British time. And then came the advent of the digital watch. Oh, I can still remember my first one. A black plastic wristband on which glowed and pulsed red numbers. And we were now beginning to talk about quartz crystals and 1,000th of a second. And milliseconds gave way to nanoseconds. And we were living in a staggering age where time, so short that we could hardly imagine it, let alone experience it, was becoming the norm. And not just that, we could wear it. First in LED and then in LCD on our wrists. And it seemed that the trajectory in which time was going was clear. Ever more accurate, but also ever more standardized time. Also, it became more visible. It appeared everywhere, flashing at us. On video recorders, then on microwave ovens, then even on conventional ovens. And it's there, in the corners of our laptops and tablets and mobile phones. Everything we do, time is there, following us. And it seems that one consequence of this is that socially or culturally, we seem to have got more focused on the smaller and smaller units of time. If you think about it, how many times do we get frustrated over what are essentially very small units of time? The cashier who suddenly, for no reason, asks the person in front of us about a Netflix series that they've been watching. Or having now to drive a half-mile section through a village at 20 miles an hour instead of 30 miles per hour. I'm driving down a motorway at 70 miles an hour. Another driver passes me at 80 miles an hour. If we keep these speeds for 5 miles, how much time do you think the other driver would have saved? Just 32 seconds. And yet that need to save time is so compelling. Why does it matter to us so much? Is it perhaps because that we feel that we've lost the battle to live our years and days? That we've even been robbed of our hours so that the only things that we can control are those stray minutes and seconds that we are left with? Maybe. I don't know. But our relationship with time, how we understand it and relate to it, has radically changed over the last 200 or so years. Seasons and daylight have now been replaced by a system of time that's based upon the oscillations of a piece of heated isotope, cesium-133. It flips between two states at exactly 9,192,631,770 times a second. But it gives us rigidity, consistency, universality. That rigid, high, accurate, passive background process delivered to us by the machine that Jeff writes about. And it's a shift that hides much deeper sets of unquestioned assumptions and unchallenged presuppositions that disclose a lot more about our human experience and how we understand ourselves and what it is to be human than just simply the development of a technology. It's all a very far cry from the swing of the sun and moon overhead. But they are still there. That slow dance of night and day and the turning of the seasons are still there. And our bodies somatically still react and respond to these things. The tides still rise and fall with the moon. And the clock on my weather station, up there on the cabin wall beside me, still pulses its 1980s style LCD numerals, that's automatically linked by radio to the National Physical Laboratory in Cumbria, tells me of the unceasing movement of time. It tells me something, a small piece of informational data. But just outside I look up at the moon, hanging, weightless, patient in her arc across the velvet darkness of night. The very same moon that is hanging above you, that binds us all in the pale ebb and flow of her light. I have watched her die and be reborn many, many times, and I think so have you. And she, too, marks time. And her light is shining down upon the upturned faces of the ox-eye daisies. And like daisies, they do not close at night, and so they glow faint and ghostly, transforming the bank beside the canal in luminous soft light, a bank of midnight sunshine. And this is how light and life proceed, one reflecting the light of the other, and so on, and so on. And I begin to understand once more what I had forgotten about time. This is the narrowboat Erica, signing off for the night and wishing you a very restful and peaceful night. Good night. Temperature outside 16.1 degrees. Inside 22 degrees. Humidity 60%. Dew point 10 degrees. Wind direction west-southwest. Wind strength 5 miles per hour. Barometric pressure 1016.3 falling. Cloud cover 76%. Cloud ceiling 17,000 feet. Precipitation nil. Moon phase 99.8% full moon. Day length 16 hours 23 minutes. Sunset 21:17. Sky casting 4:53.